Today I'm here with Lindsay McCormick, a sports broadcaster, journalist, and entrepreneur, originally from Houston, Texas. Some of the notable events she hosted were the Super Bowl, Mayweather-Pacquiao fight, and the ESPN's The Basketball Tournament. Currently, Lindsay is a judge and investor on Entrepreneur's Elevator Pitch show. She recently topped the Houston Chronicle's list of Houston's most fascinating people. How are you doing, Lindsay?
I'm doing well, and I have to admit that was the best intro that anyone has ever given me. So we're off to a good start on this podcast. Thank you. I really appreciate it. I'm doing well today. Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. Can you share with us a little bit about your story?
Yeah. So I knew exactly what I wanted to do, or what I thought I wanted to do, when I was about your age. I wanted to be a broadcaster. I used to practice in front of my stuffed animals, but I didn't know exactly what I wanted my subject matter to be. And then I grew up in a sports family. My grandpa got drafted by the Redskins in the 40s. My dad was big into baseball, my brother basketball. And when I got to college, I worked for Eagle Eye News, which was our campus broadcast station. And our sports director was leaving to go out of town and needed someone to replace him. And so I said, well, I can do it. I know about sports. And I got to work the sidelines for the Auburn LSU game. ESPN Game Day was there working, and I just fell in love with working the sidelines. And when he came back from vacation that weekend, I didn't let him have his job back. So I stayed on the sidelines for the rest of my time at Auburn, covering the football team. And when ESPN Game Day came for the Auburn LSU game, like your dad was saying about networking and how important it is, I went up to the executive producer of Game Day and I said, you guys don't happen to have an internship, do you? And I said, you guys don't happen to have a job opening, do you? And he said, well, we don't have a job opening, but if you pass the famous ESPN sports quiz, then you could start out as an intern and work your way up like everybody else. And I said, okay. So because of that connection, I then had to take the sports quiz. I somehow passed it. It was really difficult. And I started out as an ESPN intern. And then slowly over time, my demo reel from college got passed around ESPN. And I started hosting their .com shows right when ESPN.com was starting to have content. And then that led to the next job and the next job and ESPN the magazine and the Portland Trailblazers. And then finally, I hit a point in my career where social media was becoming very prevalent. And this was a couple years ago. And my DMs on Instagram were flooded with women wanting advice on how do I break into this industry? What should I expect as a female broadcaster? What are some of the pitfalls? And I thought, man, there's so many women needing advice that I wish I could help them all. And I would start to write back to some of them and would try to do as much as I possibly could to help those women that were trying to climb up the ladder. And around the same time, I realized that there was a job interview incident I had with NFL Network that wasn't the most professional, made me feel terrible as a female. And I wanted to help women navigate these pitfalls and to know, okay, this is something you can expect. And I spoke out on Instagram about it, and I went to bed that night. I closed my laptop and I woke up to it going viral. And at that moment, I didn't know if I was going to work covering sports again. I didn't know what I was supposed to do anymore. I was kind of hit with a moment of all of a sudden, all these doors opened, and I had to decide, is what I'm doing making a big difference in the world? And is this truly what I love and truly what I want to be doing? And as a result of that, I had a door opened with Entrepreneur Elevator Pitch, and there were several other jobs in between. But for time's sake, I then realized, so then I got the Entrepreneur Elevator Pitch opportunity. And I had started investing a few years prior in predominantly female-owned and tech-based companies. I was a strategic advisor with ePlay Digital, working on some of their sports games. And I knew that this was kind of a new avenue that I wanted to pivot into because it was a challenge for me. And there weren't many women in technology at that time, and there weren't as many female investors as well. And it was something that felt like the next challenge and the right challenge for me. And as I'm sitting here deciding, is this how I can make the most of my life and help impact the most lives? And is this the most fulfilling job for me? The Entrepreneur Elevator Pitch show opened up so many doors for me to help invest in predominantly female-owned companies. And to me, it just clicked. And that was what I was meant to do. And I fell in love with it. And now, since then, we obviously were shut down during COVID, but I've been able to invest in a lot of female-owned companies. One that I've been working with recently called Gloss Lab, that I'm really passionate about. And so it really is, like your dad said, about meeting the right people, making those right connections, and figuring out how can I impact the most lives for the better. So that was a long-winded answer.
You took your passion, you turned it into great success, and then along the way, you found a meaningful, impactful way to give back to others and make a difference in their lives. It's a great story.
Thank you. It's a long story. But I feel really lucky to have had the opportunities I've had in life. And we're all kind of dealt a different hand. And you have to figure out what your strengths are, what your weaknesses are, what you're passionate about. And at the end of the day, we're all just trying to make the most of our lives.
What are your top 3 principles to success?
Ooh, I have a few principles to success. I think I actually have about 5. But for starters, this has been probably the most challenging one for me. It's don't let your perfectionism be debilitating. For me, whenever I would go into job interviews, they would say, "Oh, what are your strengths and what are your weaknesses?" And I would say, "Oh, I'm a perfectionist. That's my weakness." But I didn't realize how debilitating it truly was for me, because I would think if I can't do it right the first time and I can't do it to my idea of what perfection looks like, then I'm not going to do it at all. And that would prevent me from doing so many decent things in my career and being able to tweak things and find the right people to help along the way. So it doesn't have to be perfect. You just have to start. And then principle number 2, definitely be, again, kind of along those same lines, is figure out your strengths and weaknesses for a particular project, and then find those whose strengths are your weaknesses to fill in the gaps. And that's kind of how I think, essentially made it in my career, is by figuring out what my strengths are and then hiring the right people to take over in areas that I'm lacking in. And I find from companies I've worked with in the past, that's when you find the most success, is when you don't pretend to know everything. You don't pretend to be good at everything. You say, like, these are the strengths that God has given me, and these are the things I'm not that great at, and I'm trying to get better at these things. But then you find experts in those fields that know what they're doing, and then everyone is successful. So that was number 2. And then number 3, which is a lesson that my mom taught me growing up, is view no's and closed doors as a challenge in the business setting to be more creative. And so when I was a kid, my mom would always reward me if I would find a creative solution around her no, unless it was like touching a hot stove or something that was going to injure me. If my mom would say, like, "No, you can't play with this toy right now," and I would find a creative way around it, she would then like reward me by letting me play with the toy. And that was kind of the mental approach I took in the sports broadcasting field, was whenever there would be a closed door or a job opportunity that I wanted so badly didn't work out, then I would find either a creative way around it, or then I would just have to accept at some point that, okay, it wasn't meant to be, and another job would come along. But finding creative solutions around no's, I found to be very helpful. And then my last one, which I think is probably the most important one for me personally, is to get a lot of sleep. I read this book by Ariana Huffington about sleep, and I don't think there's a book I was able to relate more to. She talked about when she was starting the Huffington Post, how she would just go days and days without sleep. And she would think, if I'm sleeping, other people are working harder. And then eventually she ended up having health issues and passing out at her desk one night at work. For me, it took a lot longer in my career to really develop those health issues, but I would go days without sleeping, thinking the same thing. If I'm not constantly working, then someone else is going to pass me by. What I have now realized is you can't run on empty. So if you're not sleeping, you're eventually going to have health issues, and you won't be able to have the same quality of work. So that to me was one of the most important.
That's a really good one. Your health is always really important. All right. This is where we turn it up. We're going to take these apart and turn them into some practical how-tos.
Okay.
So the first one, don't let perfectionism be a disabilitator. How would you turn that into a how-to for that person that is a perfectionist and may struggle with that, where they sort of don't know when to take things to that point where it's like you're a perfectionist, but you do let it become a disabilitator?
That was the most challenging one for me because I just wouldn't do. I thought if I can't do it right, I'm not going to do it at all. And then I just wouldn't do certain things. I would say, oh, I would pass on certain jobs. I thought like, oh, I can't do that well enough. But I think it's more of an exposure therapy type of situation for someone's a perfectionist. And the more times you see that, okay, if I just get started in the long run, I have accomplished more than if I just sat back on the sidelines because I didn't think I could be perfect at it. And you'll also realize that if you're, again, number two, if you're bringing in the right people to kind of overcompensate for your weaknesses, then in the end, it will end up a success for everyone and it will reach that goal of perfection. It just won't be by your own doing and on the first try. I think you have to just kind of switch your mental approach. It's not that it can't be perfect. It's just that it's going to take a different approach to it. You're not just going to nail it on the first try.
That's a tough one because we have those things where we infatuate with, and then we really want to get it as perfect as possible, but that's not going to lead you to the right results always. I don't know. Do you have something like that, Shyla, where you sort of really push to be a perfectionist about?
No.
No?
That's good. Stay that way.
I do that.
Me too.
When I have to like record stuff for content, I like literally will find myself taking 30 takes on it because I just get relentless. So maybe it's not for you. I'm the one that struggles with this.
The other thing I've noticed is that I gravitate more towards content that's organic as opposed to like perfect. Like there's podcasts I love to listen, not because they nail all the right cues, they don't mess up. It's because they're relatable. So I think it's just kind of flipping that mental approach that this has to be perfect. Because some of the greatest things are just relatable.
I like that because if you take that view and instead of focusing on your own obsession of perfection, but more on the other person's view and how they would perceive it and what they actually find value, what are they interested in? Just as you gave an example, like you actually like content that comes off more natural.
Yeah.
And then once knowing that, it's like, wait a minute, well, I don't need to take 30 takes of this content to get it right. Actually, people like it when there is a little mistake of slip up in there, not a big deal. It just sounds like a real conversation instead of an artificial one.
Yep.
That's a great example. All right. So the next one, it was around strengths over weaknesses. And I think essentially like focusing on your strengths and figuring out better solutions for the weaknesses. And our company is a good example. We always look at people's roles and everybody has their own unique strengths and weaknesses. And I always encourage people that, hey, if you have a task and it's not in your strength, raise your hand because more than likely there's probably somebody in the company that actually loves to do that kind of work and they'd be happy to do it and get it off your plate. So that's where I think like a similar, but I'd love to hear Lindsay's take on how do you practice that? Because again, some people take the whole plate and they don't really think of it that way.
These are all really challenging for me personally and for others. For this one, the first step is figuring out what your strengths are and what your weaknesses are, and then being humble enough to say, okay, these are my weaknesses. And it's hard to tell your boss, like, oh, it takes me a few times to get this right, or I need a few extra takes for this one. But I think if you set the bar where it should be, as opposed to saying like, oh, I'll nail this in the first take, like, let's just do this live, then you set yourself up for failure in a sense. So it really depends on what the project is. It really depends on, but the first step is definitely figuring out what those strengths are and what those weaknesses are. And for the example of a company, let's say someone's really good at bookkeeping and someone's really the creative. You need all of those moving parts and you need to be able to balance things out. Like you can't have one person that's good at all the finances and then another person that's good at the finances. Like you have to have that balance in a company, if that makes sense.
Know thyself. And then from there, you can take those things that you'd rather not do or not great at and see if there's somebody else that may want to do those type of things.
Yeah. You just have to surround yourself with the right people.
What are your strengths and weaknesses, Charlotte? What are you really good at doing?
Probably cooking eggs.
Ooh, that's a nice strength. I love eggs.
You got any other strengths? You got a bunch of strengths.
You're great at making jewelry. I saw that.
Is that a strength? Anything else? You have like 3,000 TikTok videos online.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
I think you can make a list of strengths, right? What about weaknesses? What about things that you either don't find yourself good at or prefer not to do?
Waking up in the morning.
That's my weakness too.
We'll talk a little later about turning weaknesses into strengths. But any other weaknesses?
No.
Really? Anything you're struggling with in the business?
Karens.
Karens, what does that mean?
People who complain a lot.
Is that like customers?
Yeah.
What do they complain about? What do they complain about?
Small things that don't matter. Probably, I don't know. They probably say things that, like, I don't know about.
So like in this example, this is where it comes to customer service, because you're right. Like dealing with the customers, there's parts of it that aren't fun.
Yeah.
And a lot of it's where they have a lot of questions, or they may have things that didn't come out right. They want to change their orders and stuff like that. And that's where it's like, well, can you find somebody to work with, having that network that may actually like doing that kind of stuff? They're a big people pleaser. They like really helping people solve challenges and things of that sort. That's actually a good one. But yeah, I think Lindsay's on the right track. Like kind of know what your strengths and weaknesses are, even write them out and just be conscious of it. So when you come across it, you're not letting it just frustrate you. You can actually say, hey, let me find a solution. Let me go find some other outsource it, find a company to deal with it, or find somebody I can work with that can take this off my plate for me.
Yeah.
That makes
You
sense?
got it.
The third one was this is a really good one. View no's and challenges. What was the word you used? View no's and challenges. What did mom tell you?
Oh, what
You
did
knew-
she say? View no's and closed doors in business is a creative challenge.
Yeah, view no's and closed doors in business as a creative challenge. I like that. Now, that's a good one. I think there's a big mindset piece. I'm wondering if there's some practical steps you can do to get there, because I think a lot of times people will get turned down. They maybe worked really hard to get into a certain school they wanted to, and they didn't get in. Then they take that no as the biggest destroying thing, that a disappointment. But it's just one of those things that it's part of the journey, and it's what ultimately you go through to get stronger. But just kind of curious, how do you get there?
I think you have to keep in mind that there's no one on the planet or in the history of the planet that has ever not heard no. I mean, even the greatest minds, I'm sure that Albert Einstein heard the word no at some point. And it's the more no's you hear, eventually you're going to hear a yes. And you can't take it personally, especially in the entertainment industry. And if I look back on my journey and all the times I heard no and I really didn't want to hear no, I wanted that job so bad. I look back and I realized that there was a reason for it. And I'm glad I didn't get that job, because I wouldn't be where I am today with that. But there's a reason. You just can't take it personally.
No, that's so true. I think the other thing that reminded me of a conversation we actually had earlier, and you should remind me what we were talking about, but if when you hear no, is understanding why no, making sure that you get that feedback, that you can say, hey, you got told no for something, you had to ask, but really, really understanding why, because that allows you to get a sense of what it was. Was it something that's in your control? Because maybe you can say, hey, I can actually fix that. Or let me understand, really trying to understand things from the other person's view. Because if you got to know, do you remember what we were talking about earlier? No? We talked a little bit about that earlier. But yeah, really dig in and understand the why for the no, and then allow that to begin the negotiation. That's part of the challenge. Now you got to overcome it. But if you don't understand why you got the no, then it prevents you from taking it as a learning opportunity where you can try to find ways to overcome it and try again. It reminds me of a client I had who was a big real estate developer, and he'd tell me a story because he came into this country as an immigrant that barely spoke the English and started building these little cafes and founded some success doing that. But when he wanted to buy real estate, first thing he did was got turned down for the loan. And I remember he told the banker, he's like, hey, let me take you out for lunch. And he's like, nothing, I don't worry about the loan. Don't worry about it. I just want to take you out for lunch. You've been nice to work with. And he takes him out for lunch. He looked down, and then there's only one thing I want to know. Why no?
Yeah.
And he said, well, you didn't have this right in your documents. These financials were off and blah, blah. He's like, okay, thank you very much. And then he went to apply for the next loan. And it was the same thing. He got turned down again. But this time it's like, hey, Bill, I'm coming over with a bottle of wine. I want to come get you drunk.
So you really get someone's secrets out.
Yeah, same thing. Why no? And then next thing you know, he started getting yeses on these loans. And when I was working for him, he had a big portfolio of real estate across the country. It's really exciting to just hear that story of starting from nothing and building up. But that was one of the key lessons I learned from him, was anytime he got no, he really, really spent the time to understand why he got told no. So it's mom's right about that. Like it's part of the challenges you got to overcome.
And most of the time you realize, especially in the entertainment industry, that it wasn't something you did wrong. It was just that they wanted something completely opposite of you. They wanted something different. And then you just have to say, it wasn't meant to be.
Absolutely. Do you remember the last principle? It was make sure you get a lot of sleep and take care of your health.
Yeah.
That's an important thing because sometimes you get obsessed with your goals and then you're pushing yourself and it's doing more harm than good because your priority should be your personal health and keeping a good balance of making progress to achieve your goals, but also taking care of yourself. So I guess looking at that from that view of that person that does get obsessed on their goals and they're so determined, how do you be conscious about your health to make sure you are getting enough sleep?
It's hard, and I am an example of someone who didn't do that. I would just push through. I would stay up memorizing playbooks and plays and watch film on some of these NFL players when I was just getting into the industry because I felt like I had to know everything, especially as a female in a male dominated industry. And eventually it caught up to me and I got an autoimmune disease as a result of it. And now I'm like forced to stop and take care of myself. And I wish someone would have said, like, look, the check engine lights are going off on your health, but you keep pushing past it and not sleeping and not taking care of yourself because you want to get ahead. And stepping back even further, I can realize that my quality of work was also suffering because I wasn't well rested. I wasn't taking care of my health. So I would get to a location, let's say the last Super Bowl is one that really stands out on my mind in Atlanta. And I got off my flight, was great the first day. And then the second day, my body said to me, like, we can't go any further. So I had to call my boss and say, like, I am so sick. I can't get out of bed today. Like, can I just have one day to like get my health together and then I'll see you guys tomorrow? And they said, sure, that works. Take all the time you need. But in the end, that's worse than if I just had taken care of myself from the start. And that's probably the first time I've ever told that story. But you really have to take care of your health and you'll notice it in your quality of work too. And you won't get behind if you take 7 hours to sleep at night. I just wish someone would have told me that sooner.
That's so true. You can get caught up in your work and not even realize that, hey, these
Yeah.
things aren't that urgent as you think it is.
Yep.
Any comments, kid? No, you're getting enough sleep. You sleep a lot. You sleep like 10 hours a day.
That's good.
It is. I shouldn't give her a hard time about it. We got a couple other questions.
What's the best mistake you've ever made?
I would say not getting jobs or having relationships in my life work out because I was too much myself and I didn't mold to what they were looking for, either a partner or a job. Because if you're not authentic to who you really are, you're not going to enjoy that job or relationship. And it's just not going to truly be the right fit, even though you want it to be in the moment. So I would say the best mistake I ever made was not getting jobs or having relationships work out because I was too much myself.
You said too much of yourself?
Too much of myself. Like I was too much. There's one job in particular that stands out. It was a job as a sideline reporter for the Miami Dolphins. And I wanted this job so bad. I got the playbook. I happened to sit next to one of the wide receivers on the way to my job interview on the flight to Miami. And he lent me his playbook and I was able to go in and be so prepared to that meeting. And I'll never forget, my agent was in the meeting with me. It was the head of hiring talent for the Miami Dolphins. And then ironically, the other guy I was going up against the job for was in the same meeting, which is the first and only time that's ever happened. And I went in there and I knew everything. I knew the X's and O's and I knew everything. And they told me, they said, we're not looking for someone to come in and kind of dissect the plays. We're looking for someone to just give the fun stories and to be more of an entertainment reporter. And this isn't really what we're looking for. So if you want to just do the fun, like frivolous stories, you can come back. And I didn't. I wanted to continue the path of sports broadcasting where I built my credibility up as someone who knew the game and knew the sport. And I just wasn't what they were looking for. And I could have tweaked who I was and could have tweaked the way I approached that, but I didn't. And I didn't get that job that I wanted so bad, but it wasn't meant to be. And it wasn't the right opportunity and a better one came along.
That's how it usually works.
Yeah. And then to go back to relationships, I think sometimes people think like, I have to be this certain way when you're going on these dates. And I need to put my best foot forward. And I am now learning in life that I am in the best relationship I've ever been in because I was true to myself from day one and didn't care about how I looked all the time and didn't care about trying to be who I thought they wanted me to be. I was just myself. And then you find your perfect match that way. So always be yourself.
What advice would you give to the next generation of leaders?
Oh, this one is an easy one for me. I would say take all advice with a grain of salt, because even my own advice, take with a grain of salt, because advice can sometimes lead people astray. And people are just thinking about their own situation and the advice that's worked for them. And while it may be helpful to you, sometimes it isn't the right advice for you. So definitely take everything with a grain of salt.
I think that's great advice. Lindsay, thank you so much for joining us. This has been a great conversation.
Thank you for having me.
You're welcome.
Thanks so much, Lindsay. Have a
Thank
great day.
you.
Bye
You
bye.
too.